Okay, so a response to some comments and some questions around bunkai and kata sequence, that kind of thing. So I mentioned in one of my comments that I'm not a fan of long strings of techniques put together. Um, I appreciate there's some value in that with regard to understanding transitionary points within kata and that kind of thing. But from personal experience, I tend to lean back towards the advice of Masanobu Shinjo of the Mitsu no Horitsu, or the law of three. Now, the way he puts it, an encounter should be ended within three techniques. I take that slightly differently, because even though that's an ideal, reality often it doesn't play out quite that way. But I do believe that if you're stringing together any more than three techniques, and that includes the initial cover, crash, the initial flinch response, whatever it might be, and that's included within that three. Any more than that, we're getting into the realms of kind of like hope, hoping that it goes according to plan, and it rarely plays out that way. Usually, your targeting will be off, your timing will be off, the strike will not have the desired effect that it does on the makiwara or the heavy bag or the pads or whatever. You'll skim the surface, you'll hit with the wrong part of the fist, there's just so much that can go wrong in a real dynamic encounter that predictability is really out the window. And again, I'll keep harping on about it, but the predetermined responses of, you hit someone in the testicles, their head comes forward. You poke them in the eye and they go like that. You go for the frog, they go like that. Yeah, usually, but often not. So again, within my experience, there's kind of like a 50-50 chance of that happening. So again, I try to never rely upon predetermined responses or what you think might happen or what might logically happen, because again, within the context of a dynamic situation where pain is nullified and there's just chaos, man, like you can't predict what's going to happen. So when it comes to investigating your kata, looking at application and trying to understand what the movements are, I do prefer to treat them as individual techniques rather than thinking, right, this one then leads into the next kata technique or this turn or the transition or whatever it might be. There's stuff within the transitions that usually begins the next technique. But I think, again, in my opinion, each sequence of kata is distinctly separate. And although I disagree with a lot of what he says, I do agree with the thing said by Pat McCarthy, whereby if you think of kata as pearls on a string, so they're all individual pearls, they're connected somewhat, but they're still individually placed. And again, when it comes to kata and the evolution of kata and the creation of kata, the Okinawan arts, I don't know how much depth there is to them, if I'm 100% honest. I don't believe there to be a massive amount of depth. I think, and again, gut feeling of my heart based upon experience and people I've spoken to and the lessons I've learned over there and since and elsewhere and within the Chinese systems, etc. It's my feeling that the Okinawan arts are a collection of lessons, techniques, and things that are kind of cherry picked from various sources that they enjoyed, that they found value in, that they found useful, and then kind of put together in a form of a champuru or a stir-fry mishmash of stuff that's very effective and very workable and kind of works as a cohesive system. When you look at the Chinese arts, there's a much more structured progression through their teaching process. And it's one that, like, unless you're going to become the inheritor of a style or the teacher of a system, you're not supposed to learn that entire style. So you might learn a few forms and then that's you good, or you might learn this beginner form, then you might learn this advanced form, you might learn this weapons form or this two-man form, and that's you kind of done. You learn it for a few years and you go away and you go do your own thing. The other thing with it is the katas are supposed to be discarded, or the forms are supposed to be discarded. They're not supposed to be preserved for the sake of the form. They're there to instill a lesson or to teach you something. And then once you've learnt that lesson, you get rid of it. You don't practice that no more. Then you're on to the next form. And then the next form kind of builds upon the lessons you've already learned. So there's this kind of this upgrade process. Certainly within the Southern Mantis that I had some experience with, that was very much the process with that. Okinawa or Okinawan karate, little bit different, but it wasn't. If we look back before, the push towards getting it accepted within the mainland as a stylized system, much in line with what was going on in the Japanese Koryu arts of, Iaijitsu and all their Bujitsu, their weapons arts, whereby they had this massive system of various kata, two-man techniques, and all this stuff as a very cohesive system. Okinawan karate wasn't like that. It was a group of guys like us, exchanging ideas, exchanging techniques, finding out what works, modifying, changing, adapting, stealing, and then kind of making it a very individualistic pursuit. And then sometimes you talk that to some people. And then they did likewise. And they'd learn a little bit of what you got, and they'd go learn a little bit of what he's got, and then put it together as their own sort of system. But, there were no names of systems. There weren't really a whole teaching process prior to, Itosu and Higashi Ono. So again, it depends what you're trying to get out of your system. But I think sometimes, having driven myself completely insane with it over the years prior, trying to make sense of a system that doesn't quite make sense can be an exercise in, driving yourself a little bit bonkers. So find your answers. And again, this is the purpose of this collective, get what answers you can for the stuff you have. But be careful trying to make everything fit, because for me, it doesn't anyway, to put it that way. For me, it doesn't. The system is maybe incomplete, maybe an unfinished project, maybe a work in progress that we're supposed to add to ourselves. But, anyway, just some thoughts on that, and, make of that what you will. Anyway, that's my thoughts for the day on kata and application.